in the United Nations and improving the working methods of the NGO committee. My name is Eleanor Openshaw. I work for the International Service for Human Rights, ISHR, and I'm very delighted to be hosting this event along with the permanent missions to the UN of France, the United Kingdom, and Uruguay, and NGO colleagues from Freedom Now and the Jacob Blaustein Institute, as well as Amnesty International, Civicus, Connectus Human Rights, and the Observatory for the Protection of Human Rights, which is a joint program of OMCT and FIDH. So we have a raft of good speakers for you today. I will introduce them to you as we get to them. There are also biographies available on the tables, along with an agenda for the meeting. We've also put together a brief backgrounder for those who are less familiar with the NGO committee. There are copies in the room. Please grab a copy if that is good for you. The event is being webcast. We're very much looking forward to receiving comments and questions from those who are watching us from afar. The hashtag is #NGO committee. Ahead of giving you a little bit of framing for this conversation, I wanted to turn to the state co-sponsors for opening remarks. I know that the two ambassadors who very kindly made time to be here have also got to dash off to other things. So Ambassador Delattre, I want to pass over to you. I understand you're going to make some opening remarks on behalf of all the three state co-sponsors. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. A warm word of welcome to all of you. Please, ladies and gentlemen, I think you can hear me now. It is wonderful to see the great level of interest from both member states and civil society on this issue through the attendance this morning. I want to thank all of you for your commitment, for your participation. I think it's an important meeting. It is my pleasure to speak here on behalf of the co-sponsors, the United Kingdom, Uruguay, and France. We are very supportive of the initiative taken by ISHR and Freedom Now to hold such an event. We welcome their efforts at the forefront of the civil society attention and activism on the work of the Committee on NGOs and the protection of civil society space at the UN, and to boost the discussion on this issue. The value that civil society brings to building inclusive, tolerant, and resilient societies domestically is well recognized, but there should also be no doubt surrounding the indispensable contribution of NGOs to the work of the UN on all agenda items, from human rights to development and international peace and security. Civil society brings enthusiasm, a fresh perspective, and valuable expertise which can enrich the discussions and deliberations of member states. This is why their consultation by ECOSOC is enshrined in Article 71 of the UN Charter. In this respect, the ECOSOC Committee on NGOs has a vital role to play in facilitating access and securing civil society participation at the UN. We all have a stake in ensuring that the committee is fulfilling its mandate. This is not a small job, and there are many challenges that we are all aware of. In recent years, we have seen the number of applications from civil society steadily increase, with hundreds of new applications coming in every year. It is vital that the committee takes timely decisions on deferred applications and ensure that it carries out its work in an efficient, effective, and transparent manner. So we hope that such events like this one will draw in further interest and scrutiny from the broader UN membership on the committee, which has the responsibility to consider recommendations of status of NGOs from all regions and which work on a variety of pressing global challenges. We welcome the existing focus of ECOSOC on improving the working methods of the committee, including by passing a decision earlier this year on webcasting all open sessions. This is just great. This has opened up the deliberations of the committee to NGOs, including remote ones, to civil society, member states, and all people across the globe. We hope that ECOSOC will continue to deliberate this important issue. So, my friends, I don't want to take up too much of your time, as this event is really to hear from you, from civil society. We're keen to hear of your experience with the process of accreditation and what it means for their organization, your organization and work. It is our pleasure to facilitate this opportunity here at the UN. We've been disheartened to see precocious committee time taken up in debating procedural issues, such as whether a single ECOSOC accredited NGO can address the committee. It is important also that the NGO committee operates in a fair manner and that it bases its decisions in compliance of ECOSOC Resolution 1996/31. We need to collectively work hand in hand, mano en la mano, member states and civil society, in the spirit of fairness and transparency that is at the basis of this resolution. We hope that this will be the case in the next regular session of the committee. But in the meantime, we look forward to working others to facilitate dialogue through events such as this. So this was my long way to say a warm word of welcome to each and every one of you, and I'm really pleased to be here with my colleagues from the UK and also from Uruguay, and we look forward to hearing from you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much for those warm words, for setting up this conversation. I want to just invite Ambassador Rosali from the Permanent Mission of Uruguay to also share some thoughts with us. I want to acknowledge here the role of Uruguay, along with Chile and Mexico, most particularly in being instrumental in driving forward the initiative to institute webcasting of the NGO committee. Ambassador Rosali.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here and for giving me this opportunity just to share a few quick thoughts on the work of the NGOs committees and particularly on your contribution. We're more than pleased to co-sponsor this event because, as you know, Uruguay is a member of the group called ACT, Accountability, Coherence and Transparency. And for us, the promotion of transparency in all of the works of the United Nations is a top priority. Contributing to improve the working methods of the different organs has always been in the center of efforts to help the organization to be more accountable and effective. We celebrate the adoption by the ECOSOC of the decision instituting webcasting of open sessions of the Committee on NGOs, and we were both pleased and proud to introduce the draft text together with Chile and Mexico. The decision adopted allows for more transparency in the relations of the committee with civil society, as well as a better understanding on the part of the NGOs regarding what to expect from the committee in the fulfillment of its mandate. It is of utmost importance that the work of the committee can now be followed by a larger number of NGOs, especially in the developing world. The committee has a privileged position to encourage participation of NGOs in all activities in the UN, and the role to be played by civil society is crucial, for example, to achieve implementation of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. Civil society and other states not members of the committee have the right to see that the decisions taken by the committee are in accordance with applicable rules and that they are adopted in good faith. This is easier now that its public sessions are webcasted to the world. Even when webcasting is only a step in the search of updating and improving working methods, it is not a minor thing, since in the first session after its approval, it has registered an increase of more than 5% of recommendations in the case of new applications, as well as in the recommendation on various NGOs in the field of human rights that in the past were usually deferred. Another testimony to the improvement of the interaction with the NGOs in the webcasted session was that the question and answer periods that are held on a daily basis during the sessions have been more dynamic and allowed several recommendations for NGOs that participated in such mechanism. And finally, we would like to reiterate our appeal to more states to stand as candidates for the NGOs committee in the next elections to be held in 2018. And allow me once again to underline the need of reinforcing cooperation between the UN and civil society to address the increasing challenges that humanity faces at the present moment. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That's much appreciated. We would definitely agree that webcasting has spoken to a very important principle of transparency and has allowed people who had no possibility to come here to New York to follow consideration of their cases, which we consider a very important and significant step forward. So thank you so much to those who supported that initiative. We know that you may have to go at any time. Thank you again if you have to jump out. I wanted to just say a couple of words just before passing to our speakers here on the panel, just to give you a framing of the conversation that we are envisaging for today. Bless you. Don't get distracted by our attempts to just sort out a Skype link up there. We'll do that as we go. So both ambassadors here spoke of the normative standards that define rights to participate as civil society. We know civil society has rights to unhindered access to and communication with UN bodies. That's an recognized international human rights standard. We know that the role of civil society in providing diverse and constructive critical input is essential to promoting the principles of the UN Charter. And yet, despite these standards and this acknowledgement, there are restrictions to participation for civil society in the UN. And these restrictions mimic, to some degree, the squeeze on civil society globally. This at the very time the UN should be providing a platform, a safe space for civil society to provide input, call for accountability, particularly when that is restricted back home at national level. We know the NGO committee is a gateway, an important gateway for civil society into the UN, and it carries out a necessary function of assessing applications for ECOSOC accreditation. But it has been criticized for some aspects of its practice. We will explore some of that here today. The committee operates in a context where the participation of civil society is increasingly questioned and discussion on participation increasingly polarized. And that is of great concern, and this needs to change. We believe that by transforming the culture by which states understand the role of civil society and support it, that transformation must and can start here at the UN. And that we need to find common ground. We are seeking a conversation. We need to find common ground on the importance of communication between the politic and civic societies, accepting that our views may and can and will at times differ. So in this conversation, we were wanting to speak about why civil society is important at the UN, how do you encourage civil society participation, and what is needed to improve the practice of the NGO committee so that it operates to fulfill its mandate in a fair, transparent, and apolitical manner. And there have been positive developments spoken of here. However, more is needed. Now, we know that one member of the NGO committee at the most recent session called for a discussion on working methods within the committee session. And we welcome this, and we hope that this conversation might provide some useful, positive input for that discussion. So there's a conversation to be had today. There's common ground to be found today, we hope. I'm going to now turn to our speakers. Just to remind you, there are biographies of each speaker in the room. Let me turn first to Robert Mahoney. Robert, you are Deputy Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. We know that CPJ was quite a high-profile case in terms of gaining accreditation. I wonder if you can share with us some part of that story of getting accreditation, the multiple deferrals, and remind us why it was important for you to keep pushing, to keep going. Why is participating in these spaces important for an organization such as yours? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, let me just begin by explaining what the Committee to Protect Journalists is. We are an independent nonprofit that was set up in 1981 by journalists to protect journalists and fight for press freedom around the world. We are an international group, and we are funded by individual and foundation contributions, and we do not accept any government money at all. So we are totally independent. We believe that our voice as a defender of journalists was needed in the United Nations, and so we wanted to be able to participate fully in the workings of the UN and be involved with the various organizations. We were involved through partners, but we did not have accreditation. We therefore decided back in 2012 that we would apply for the so-called ECOSOC accreditation. Little did I know what an incredibly arcane process that would be. I felt like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole into another universe, the Wonderland, where things were distorted. The real world was much smaller. The gateway was definitely smaller to the UN. We were rejected a total of 7 times by this committee, who came back with requests for information which we had already given and published, information which was available in our published materials, annual reports. So we felt that we were being obstructed, and but we persisted. We persisted because we felt that press freedom around the world was actually under threat. The United Nations as an organization, its mandate is there for it to protect press freedom and journalists. And so we felt that our voice was more necessary than ever. We pushed things until May of last year, when the committee actually rejected our application. And so we have some advantages as an organization that's based in New York, and we are fairly well known. And so we were able to go to friends and supporters and attempt to get that decision overturned. I mean, the UN Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, said he was deeply disappointed, and that journalists are fragile. The journalists are already facing undue restrictions on their work, and that this did not help. The then French ambassador called the decision deeply disappointing and disturbing, and said that the vote can only be understood, quote, as a reprisal against this NGO, namely us. And the then U.S. ambassador said that the NGO committee that voted against CPJ acts more and more like an anti-NGO committee and called the move outrageous. This, therefore, was the reaction. It helped build a wave, and we were able to take the decision to the full 54-member council where it was overturned, and we were granted ECOSOC status. I think that the lesson for us is that, you know, persistence paid off, but we are, by many standards of NGOs, a larger organization. We have the advantage of being based in New York, and we have the advantage of being journalists with access to the media. I mean, we are journalists. I'm a former journalist myself, and so we are able to amplify our voice. I think what is important for us is when I look at other NGOs who do not have those advantages, how do they get accredited? How do they overcome this what I would call obstructionist and petty politicized factions in these committees who make it their sole purpose to prevent NGOs that represent the values of the United Nations but are not in consonance with their particular political values at the time. How do we get around them? And that's the question facing this organization today. Transparency is one method, but there are many other things that need to be done. So that's our experience. We're glad that we have our accreditation and that I can walk into this building today without too much hassle in order to share the story of the Committee to Protect Journalists with you. And I thank you for this opportunity, and I thank all those members of the committee that supported CPJ's application and the other NGOs that also did the same. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robert, for those succinct thoughts. I'm going to turn now to the National Director of the Legal Resource Centre in South Africa, Janet Love. Janet, the LRC also spent several years having their case deferred. I know that colleagues of yours travelled here to New York, which must have signified considerable expense and resources for you. Can you share with us again that the idea of what that experience of multi-deferral was like and why you persisted?
So first of all, thanks very much. And just to say that it's a little difficult sometimes to be in this sort of meeting where you feel in many instances you may be speaking more to the converted than to those who actually need to hear. And so the remarks that I make are in the hope that somehow we will be able to find a way to engage more with the UN as a whole, but in particular with the committee. Yes, we did have 5 different cycles and many sets of unnecessary questions and repeated questions at that. And I can only endorse what has been said by Robert in terms of CPJ, and I'm sure that we'll hear other experiences that are in many respects far more egregious. I think the problem that we have, the Legal Resources Centre is an organization that uses the law, upholds the rule of law, and in many respects is at the coalface of dealing with socioeconomic rights in particular, not just within South Africa, but also internationally. So we've worked extensively with a number of the special rapporteurs, with other colleagues from different civil society organizations, and also in some instances with members of delegations of state parties who work in particular fields and areas that are of major concern to us. And for us, the engagement in this kind of arena is similar to what CPJ experienced, is that one wants to be able to know that one's engaging not through other mechanisms and other alliances, but one's engaging as an organization in the organization's own right. But I think more importantly for us as an organization that seeks to use and use the law and also make sure that the law provides the necessary underpinnings, we've experienced real misgivings about the way in which ECOSOC conducts its business. At the moment, the idea is that ECOSOC is intended to be a gateway. In practice, ECOSOC, in a very kind estimation, is a gatekeeper. And the basis of that gatekeeping is not very clear. So the premise on which a question is asked, or the basis for finding any piece of information useful or not useful, is not clear. So the consequence of that is that the delegations or the representatives of different countries who do serve on the committee are representatives who can not easily be held to account, because you've got a situation where their own conduct can be as inconsistent as, in some instances, apparently intended to block as opposed to facilitate civil society participation, and it's very difficult to hold those individuals to account in terms of standards that are set by the committee itself in terms of the way in which it seeks to conduct its affairs and to conduct its business. And in the absence of that fundamental, it is really, really difficult for civil society organizations in our own countries to hold the representatives on the NGO committee to account. And I think that that in itself is a problem. The last thing that I wanted just to indicate is that at the moment, it seems to me that what has happened is that we've heard that there has been some progress, and I would also be one, the LRC would be one of the organizations that strongly supports the fact that we have now got an open prospect of observing and listening in to what is taking place in the committee without having to be in New York. But the point about that is, again, unless there's a standard of conduct against which we can measure the behavior that we're hearing about at a distance, not having, for example, the advantage of CPJ in terms of amplification of voice through journalism or through being present in New York, it's not going to help. It's not enough. And I think that that's really, more than anything, we've got to have a way in which the committee acts in terms of the mandate to facilitate and enable, and in that way be a gateway, not to be a gatekeeper that is acting defensively and is acting inconsistently and very, very often making the work of supporting democracy, supporting human rights in domestic situations even more difficult because of the opportunistic behavior of representatives in New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. I like the phrase "be a gateway, not a gatekeeper." I wish I'd thought of that. That's very snappy and effective. The question of how to make the change, we are obviously going to address in this meeting, and we will get to Moran here at the end of the table, who will outline some suggestions and options that a group of NGOs have come up with as prompts for conversation. Ahead of that, though, I invite you to swivel your heads round to the screen where the coordinator of the Foreign Policy and Human Rights Project at Conectas Human Rights in Brazil, Camila Sano, is kindly waiting patiently for us there. Camila, can you hear us well?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly, crystal clear. It's wonderful to have you there. Camila, we know the NGO committee is required to ensure participation of all NGOs from all regions, and very particularly developing countries. I'm going to pass over to you. I know you've been following the conversation. You're speaking from an organization that is interested, among other things, in the amplification of Global South voices. And I'm wondering if you can provide some thoughts as to how change in committee practice might enable that better.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to have the opportunity to be here with you using technology and also showing how accessible the event can be if we use different tools like video cast or the webcasting that we just approved, and it was very welcome in the NGO committee work. So I'm Camila Sano from Brazil. Conectas Human Rights is my organization. I'm based in São Paulo, and we've been working with the UN for a while. And what's important is the access to the UN. Of course, NGOs can interact with the United Nations in different ways, but having the consultative status really improve and give strength to the work of civil society at the United Nations. So if I may, I would like to highlight my remarks coming from the perspective of a Global South organization that has a consistent work with the UN, and how the consultative status is an important tool to make sure that we can have the proper access to negotiations and also to actually have our voice heard at the United Nations. And in the end, what we discuss is not just improving the methods of work and the functioning of the NGO committee. What we are actually discussing is how we can improve and increase the civil society participation at the UN. And for this, I see two main reasons why we should have an NGO committee that actually is fostering more participation of civil society at the UN. The first one is that the UN, to be more relevant, should be connected to what's happening on the ground. So sometimes we are watching what's being discussed in Geneva or in New York, and we feel like kind of a disconnection of what's actually happening in our countries. So having more civil society actively participating in Human Rights Council sessions or General Assembly, different committee sessions, will feed the UN with relevant and updated information. So in the end, we hope that the distance, the long distance from Brazil to Geneva, Brazil to New York, or from countries in Africa or in any other part of the globe can be smaller once civil society can be heard in these spaces. And of course, having the consultative status is an important way to do so. The second reason why we believe here at Conectas that the NGO committee should improve its functionality to raise more space for civil society is because sometimes civil society voices silence in our own countries. So being able to speak up at the UN is also a way to protect and to give more visibility to what civil society is doing in different countries. So it's also an important way. So sometimes we are struggling, for instance, to combat torture in Brazil or police violence, and we are not having much success using our national channels. But when we go to the UN and also have our voice amplified in the Human Rights Council, for instance, it's very important because it gives us strength to continue our struggle here in Brazil. So it's also a way to strengthen the work that we do nationally. And as I'm speaking from a Global South country, it's important to highlight that we still need to work more to give more voice to Global South organizations. It's not just increasing the civil society participation at the UN, but to diversify the voices that are heard at the UN. So in this case, it's sadly we see many civil society coming from Global South requesting the consultative status and seeing constant deferral or postponement of their cases. So having an NGO with a better functioning would strengthen, of course, the work of also these Global South organizations. And also because for us, it's very difficult to be there present in the sessions. So I'm using Skype and I'm using the technology to be able to be with you there. Because of course it's very difficult to go and travel. Sometimes it's a matter of resource, financial resource, human resource that doesn't allow us to be present in every session. So having this kind of possibilities of increasing participation and including remote participation is something that will truly diversify the voice of civil society at the UN. So I'm very thankful that the ECOSOC adopted the resolution, including allowing the sessions of the NGO committee to be webcasted. And also, hopefully, we will have more and more chains in its functionality, so we can have other ways of civil society to interact with the NGO committee, for instance, with remote participation from organizations that cannot be in New York to follow in person the sessions of the NGO committee. So, well, that was what I wanted to share with you, and thank you again to allow me to participate in this Skype.
Camila, thank you so much. That worked perfectly, and it does seem to say that there's great potential for remote Q&A sessions in the NGO committee. That was crystal clear. Thank you so much. You'll stay there with us and hopefully be able to respond to further questions as we go. I'm going to now turn to Henry Tufane. He's the Executive Director of People's Watch and a member of the Executive Group of the International Dalit Solidarity Network, IDSN. Henry, we know that IDSN is the NGO that has now been longest on the books of the NGO committee, deferred for almost 10 years. It seems to me an experience of compounded exclusion, what is happening in this case. And I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts as to how this can be resolved and, again, why it's important for you as IDSN members to persist with the request for accreditation.
Thank you, Chair. I come to this event with a lot of burden on my shoulders. The speakers before me are people who waited for a long time before this committee, and they have all crossed the bridge. I'm on the other side of the bridge as an individual, as an organization working in a particular country, and as the Executive Committee member of the International Dalit Solidarity Network, which has been having its application pending with this committee for the past 9 years. We have the distinction, as stated by others, that we are the longest pending application before the United Nations NGO committee. The burden is to make sure that our hope is not let down. The burden is to make sure that there are no further reprisals for having spoken the truth to all of you today. I come here only because we believe in human rights, and human rights is based on hope. And it is that hope which brings us back to this committee to speak the truth and hope that the truth will lead to a process of change in this committee. Well, the first sign of hope is that you have, in your march towards transparency, moved on to webcasting. Congratulations for the decision you have taken on behalf of a number of people who will never be able to reach the corridors of this building. It is ironical that we speak of shrinking civil society space in the state from which I come, in my country. It is ironical that we face shrinking civil society space in the country itself. And it's ironical that there is shrinking civil society space in this gateway, where the gatekeeper ensures that you are stopped, you are questioned, you are re-questioned, you are re-questioned. After 5 years, questions that were asked earlier, and there is nobody with a conscience to stand on our side. What is the International Dalit Solidarity Network? The International Dalit Solidarity Network grew out of our reflections on the 50th anniversary of the UDHR and realizing that the human rights of over 260 million people from different countries around the world, drawn from different continents around the world, were facing a discrimination, a gross violation of human rights based on a system called caste, and which this institution had since then not been sensitive to. And therefore, we formed IDSN in London in the year 2000, March 2000. We were engineered towards forming the IDSN because of the openings that 1997, first the third committee in Geneva did on considering caste to be brought within the ambit of the consideration of the UN third committee. That was the first door that was opened to us. Had you not opened that door, we would have never come here with our application. We followed working with the UN Subcommission on Human Rights, with a number of UN special rapporteurs who came out with reports on principles and guidelines on caste-based discrimination which were passed. We went to Durban. We participated in the World Conference Against Racism in Durban. We were not successful, but we were successful in making the global community aware of the phenomenon of a gross violation of human rights which the global community was being sensitive to. This is what brought us in the year 2007 to the NGO committee with our application. We have since been pending for 9 years with 82 questions, the last 2 questions coming this year. I don't need to repeat what has been said. It is the same questions because there is no creativity. Creativity is lost when you come to 82 questions. But the politicization is that all these questions come from one country. And that is serious. And that is what I leave to your conscience to respond. We have had questions that were raised after the committee is in session. We respond to the question the next day. On the 4th day, you have further 2 questions asked. I don't want to get into what the questions are, but this is the pattern that was there. You had questions for which answers are available. Please go to the website of the IDSN. I feel very bad to talk about our own website, and you will find answers. And you will find there all the contribution that the United Nations has made to the phenomenon of caste-based discrimination documented. I want to thank and recall at this time the number of organizations that came forward during these 9 years period and earlier to ensure our participation in Geneva. Not very much our participation in the UN headquarters, but more the participation in Geneva. And what have we done? We have, over the years, participated in a number of sessions and ensured that issues of Dalit women, issues of Dalit children, issues of caste-based slavery, issues of education, access to justice, issues of caste and business, issues of manual scavenging, carrying shit on the head, forced prostitution, etc., were all raised on the floor of the Human Rights Council with wonderful statements from the Secretary General of the United Nations as well as successive High Commissioners for Human Rights in Geneva. Powerful statements, one after the other. We have worked in ensuring that the UN principles and guidelines have been, at least as draft, been accepted. A number of references through resolutions that have been mooted through the work of IDSN and its members. We have participated in side events year after year, in the 34th session, in the 31st session, in the 29th session, in the 26th session, in the 23rd session, and I can go on. And most of these are along with state governments, along sometimes with the Office of the High Commission. What is it that has gone wrong with our application? We have been funded by the European Union. We also have made progress within the European Union in terms of raising the issue. And I can tell you, these are not issues related to any country in one continent. These are issues of caste-based discrimination across the globe in countries that are more than one continent based. We have had recommendations, we have had special rapporteur visits, contributions to the UPR, contributions to the treaty bodies, you name it, we have been there. But why? Why is it that the conscience has not moved? This we say, we are forced to say, and if I don't say it, I will not be truthful, that this is a reprisal. And this is a reprisal leading to the exclusion of millions of people who want to be included in the UN committee, into the portals of the UN, contributing to strengthening the sensitivity of this UN body to the violation of human rights faced by 260 million people, women, men, children, aged, transgenders, etc. And therefore, I would leave it to others who have experience to come up with solutions that are long-lasting. But it is important that you also trace the parallel statements of some of the members who do this blocking exercise on the floor of the Human Rights Council in terms of resolutions relating to civil society participation. The same members who raise questions here fight the terminology of human rights defenders on the floor of the Human Rights Council. I think one major change that is called for is that this committee has people like members who are here, state parties who are here, who have had the courage to speak loud, to say that they stand on the side of civil society, on the side of civil society that they may not agree to, but on the side of civil society which will reflect the heartbeat of the poorest of the poor in this globe. Thank you.
Thank you for those words. I think before we move on to a few suggestions for how civil society participation could be encouraged, and specifically improving working methods of the NGO committee, I'd like to just invite anyone from the floor who might wish to make a comment or ask a question of those speakers who have spoken so far. Please, at the back.
Good morning. My name is Bismillah Faryad. I'm from Nepal. I'm so glad to be here today. I have been coming to different United Nations, different community meetings. This is the first time I heard about Dalit issue. I'm from Dalit. When I was growing up, I experienced injustice and discrimination every day in my life. And even yesterday in Nepal, 2 10-year-old Dalit boys and girls were raped and they were killed. No one talk about this kind of issue. I think I'm so glad that I'm here, and thank you for bringing this issue. Look at this room. UN should be equal home for everybody, from grassroots level to policy level. And who come here? How many people are here from grassroots level and development countries? You can imagine that. I was there in the expert community meeting other day. There was not even a single person who brought the issue about this kind of problem. So I hope this meeting will do something to bring the issue of grassroots level. If we don't bridge the gap between grassroots and policy level, I don't think we can reach the sustainable goal. That's why I'm very glad to be here, and I want to work with a different community and a different group, and I want to participate in the different meetings, and I want to be speaker because I have been working for Dalit and women for 25 years, and I want to speak my experience. And I need to be the ECOSOC accredited to be a speaker and to be member of the community, and that doesn't make sense. You know, it has to be emulated, like how everyone get the access to be here and to raise the voice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. If it's okay with you, we'll take a couple more and then ask you to intervene. Yes, please.
Is it on? Yes. And my name is Amadeus Shabinsky. I'm from the World Information Transfer. One question to you, sir, from Idea Sen. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know if it's unorthodox to ask such a question. And then I have 2 questions for CPJ and for the legal resource. if I'm not mistaken, I think you stated that there is one country that is standing in the way of IDSN. Please correct me if I'm wrong, and if I'm not wrong, would we be able to know the name of this member state? And to CPJ, as well as to the Legal Resource Center, what is the biggest obstacle that CPJ and the Legal Resource Center can foresee as its most worrisome conflict towards its membership within ECOSOC? Thank you.
That was cheeky, 2 questions in one. Any further question at this point? Yes.
Like a comment and, also a question. Elizabeth da Costa from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights here in New York. The High Commissioner was actually mandated by the UN Human Rights Council 2 years ago to produce a report on civil society space. And at that time, we published in the report a little update on the NGOs committee. You can find it there, paragraph 57. And the words that the High Commissioner used was confusing and alienating to refer to the various requirements and modalities of the NGOs committee or ECOSOC accreditation process. The High Commissioner also issued a recommendation in that report that we are very happy to see it's on the way of being implemented, which is to increase the transparency of the work of the committee through webcasting of the meetings. A new report on the same topic on civil society space is going to be so prepared and issued next year. And I think my colleagues who will be working on the report will soon start to issue a call for contributions both to member states through the permanent missions in Geneva and also to civil society organizations. And I think that will be a great opportunity also to further discuss the reform needed. My question will be on, there was one speaker who referred to ECOSOC accreditation status as a gateway. And my questions will be, ECOSOC accreditation status is definitely, we all know it, a very important gate to access the UN. Now, if that gate, as the speaker said, is very narrow, what are other gates? Are there other gates, and how much have you been using those other gates? Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Let's take one more, and then I'll come back to the speakers.
Well, I wanted to follow up on this question to Mr. Tufaj. I remember the participation of your group in the World Conference and in Durban.
Felice, can you forgive me? Could you present yourself just for
those
in
I'm
the
sorry,
room who don't know?
Felice Geer, the Jacob Laston Institute. Looking at the NGO committee, I'm wondering if you said all the questions came from one country, and there was no one with a conscience to speak up for us. So my question is the following: did that country serve as a member continuously all of those years that you applied? Number one. Did you approach any other country to speak up? And did they actually refuse, or were they simply not engaged? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So there are questions to you, Henry, and to you, Janet. Janet, do you want to go first? And to Robert. Okay. Who wants to go first? Henry, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah.
I was extremely polite on this floor. My dress could have given me away, but we speak the truth. And India was the country which has continuously raised these 82 questions. And having said this, I think it is important to not keep quiet, to also state that within the country, I am told in writing, in a court of law, that what has gone wrong with my organization in my country is that I communicate and document and pass information to the UN special rapporteurs on court, along with meeting embassies. I'm saying this because the chair said this is a conversation, and the conversation should take us forward. I think today should signal the day when we don't talk about the past, but we would be able to talk about a future where these past events will not recur within this committee. And that is why the truth is being spoken to. Secondly, the question that is asked, and it is a very interesting question, are there other gates? Of course, thank you for the question. If the other gates were not there, we would never have been able to survive from 2000 till 2017, ensuring that the issue of caste-based discrimination was appreciated by the Human Rights Council, earlier by the Commission on Human Rights, the UN Subcommission, various treaty bodies, various special rapporteurs, years after years, UPR recommendations by a host of countries across the globe. All this has been possible because we have taken the floor on behalf of a number of our members. We are made up of members with network members in different countries, as well as human rights organizations and members from caste-affected countries. And therefore, others allow us to take the floor. Of course, questions were also asked about how we took the floor. Questions were also asked about how we sponsored a side event. Questions were also asked about who funded a side event. I think there is a limit. Side events where the Office of the High Commission was present. A side event where the High Commissioner for Human Rights was present. So there are a number of open doors. Our difficulty is that we are more of an embarrassment to other NGOs, but we never so far consciously let our voice not be heard in the fora that were open to us in Geneva. I think we opened all the doors. We used all the doors that were there. It's a pain on other organizations, getting an accreditation, making sure that their list is not full. Those were the difficulties. But more than that, it is humiliating. It is humiliating that you are humiliated because of a violation in your respective countries. And those who are humiliated out of a violation are humiliated at this gate by those who are claiming to be gatekeepers. And that is what I hope will change the scenario. I think these were the two. And did that country serve continuously? Of course, and I'm perplexed to know how a country could be serving there continuously.
For a lack of fixed terms as members, which will be something Maren will talk to, I'm sure. Janet, please.
The two questions I'm going to answer together because I think that they are related. The threat that I see most strongly is the threat of legitimacy. I come from a global South country, and the whole remoteness of the international human rights institutional arrangement is something that is constantly needing to be tackled, and the voice and the agenda of people in the global South is not coming strongly enough forward into the agenda and onto the floor. And I think that many organizations, Connect Us being one, and certainly India having many civil society organizations being present, are making contributions through the various mechanisms, special rapporteurs, independent experts, working groups, also in terms of engaging with UPR processes, and so on and so forth, as well as obviously engaging at the level of the High Commissioner's Office itself. But I think that the difficulty is that the UN system is a very complex system. And to have the kind of voice that local Global South organizations with the kinds of issues that need to be brought forward, those voices and the amplification of those voices is something that actually needs facilitation. And to me, more than anything, it is that which the ECOSOC committee ought to be focusing its attention on. In other words, the idea that the ECOSOC committee will engage in a number of procedural issues alone, for me, is not encouraging. If we go back to how does the committee understand its mandate? What is meant by being a gateway? What does that mean? It's a gateway to a whole system. And I think that unless there's a rethinking of what does it mean to be a gateway, you then get a problem that the opportunities that people and organizations and civil society groups can take are opportunities that are not done to maximize the voice of civil society organizations, but are done despite the obstacles. And that, I think, is the big problem.
Robert, over to you.
Yeah, could you remind me what the specific question was?
Once again, my name is Amadeus Shabinsky from the World Information Transfer. What is the biggest obstacle that CPJ, as well as the Legal Resource Center, can foresee as its most worrisome conflict towards its membership within ECOSOC? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that, my crystal ball is a little cloudy as to which specific obstacle there is. I think generally, though, as I was saying in my opening remarks, is that we as an organization see a shrinking of the space for freedom of expression generally and press freedom in particular. And I feel that those member states who disregard basic international law and standards regarding freedom of expression will be the obstacle to us pursuing the promotion of this agenda within the body here.
Camila, I want to come to you in case you wish to come in on any of these questions. There was no specific question to you, but you may have some thoughts.
Is it okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I was thinking about the question of what are the other gates besides having the consultative status. I think it's not just a matter of having access to the building, the UN building, and be able to attend in person the sessions, but actually to be heard. And in this case, I was thinking about two tracks. The first one is how states interact with civil society. And sometimes what we feel is that some states prefer to have a constant dialogue with certain organizations. They are based in New York and Geneva for a while, and are international organizations. And sometimes even, having invitation for meetings, there are strategic meetings. They are limited to only international organizations instead of also opening to other organizations. We have some Global South organizations that were able to have permanent representatives in Geneva, for instance. Connect Us, we have a person that we share with two other organizations from Latin America because the cost is so high in Geneva, so we share that person with two other organizations. But even though we have a person there, and sometimes we don't, we heard about important meetings, but we are not invited to those meetings. So it's one concrete example on how, although you have the consultative status, some of these strategic meetings are not happening in the plenary of the Human Rights Council session. So that's one example. And the other one is who gets, for instance, who is more consulted during drafting a resolution as during a Human Rights Council session. Sometimes we also, from the Global South organization, we struggle to have access to the draft resolutions. And that would be also something that we could work since the beginning with states. As I mentioned in my remarks before, we are the ones that are living constantly, day by day, some of the issues that are object of Human Rights Council resolutions. And we could contribute since the beginning of that. So this would be like the first track is how is the active interaction with states, but then you have the UN mechanisms and bodies. So it's important to keep the profile of special procedure mandate holders open and people that are used to work with civil society. Otherwise, if we keep with that profile of special procedure mandate holders that are usually only consulting with academia or states or experts, we will continue to have this long distance between civil society from the Global South and the UN mechanisms. And also talking about the UN space, it's very important the role developed by the regional office of the OHCHR. So in our case, our regional office is based in Santiago in Chile, and they're very, very open to civil society groups. So most of the interaction that we have goes through this regional office. It's quite important for us because as a result of this constant interaction, we are able to see the UN, the Office of the High Commissioner taking public statement of important developments in human rights situations in Brazil that really needs the attention of the office.
Camila, thank you very much for that. I think at this point in the conversation, we'll turn to Maren Turner, Executive Director of Freedom Now, who is going to put forward some suggestions, some options for reform of the NGO committee, but also some recommendations on how more broadly civil society participation could be encouraged. I see somebody put their hand up there. I will come to further questions after Maren has spoken, if that's okay with you.
Thank you, Eleanor. So, as Eleanor mentioned previously, we've been speaking in amongst ourselves, the NGO community, as well as with many of you from the missions, about ways that the NGO committee can be reformed, ways that the process of accreditation can be changed, as well as ways to work within the current structure as is to try to make a more hospitable working environment for everyone, and certainly for organizations seeking accreditation. So I just want to run through about 5 different categories of ways to improve the system. And as I said, they all fit within either trying to work within the current regime, changing the current regime, or considering dismantling the regime and instead putting in place an alternative system. First, I want to say one of the things that's really important, and I think that does get missed with the NGO committee, because when we talk about it, we talk about how it is just the gatekeeper for accreditation, which it is. But it is more than that, and it was intended to be more than that. It was intended to be the body that was the chief instrument between which the UN and civil society, those organizations that had accreditation, engage. And there are a couple of modalities in place already that could help ensure that there is at least dialogue going on between civil society and the NGO committee, and that's something that we don't see. And one of those is actually Article 61 of 1996-31, the governing ECOSOC resolution creating the NGO committee, actually calls for consultations to take place between accredited civil society organizations and the NGO committee regularly, and specifically before every NGO committee session, and in fact calls for reports to be sent to ECOSOC. Now, to our knowledge, this is not something that's been in place. It certainly hasn't been in the last couple of years since we've had accreditation. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it seems to us that it presents a really important opportunity for accredited organizations to sit with NGO committee members, many of whom are somewhat suspicious of civil society, and open some dialogue. And there's plenty of orders of business that could be raised in those sessions, but certainly chief among them would be the business of the NGO committee, since unfortunately that is where there are so many blockages. Another one is a precedent that was set in 2016, whereby civil society representatives were given the floor and an opportunity to make a statement before the opening session of the NGO committee. This is unfortunately something that's not happened since that time, but that's another opportunity for civil society to engage in the floor of the NGO committee. Now, going to NGO committee membership, and this is something that's been raised by many people, and Henry did as well, and looking at ways, we looked at ways of how do we improve the membership, how do we make it more diverse and more accountable. It's a small committee, really, when you think about it, and you look at the business that it does with only 19 members. There are no term limits, as Henry pointed out. And there is a high number of states on the committee that don't have especially strong records for engagement with civil society in their own countries and seem suspicious of international organizations. So from this perspective, there's three practical solutions that could be considered here. One is to encourage more states that are very, very open to diverse categories of civil society and NGO issues, whether they agree with them or don't agree with them, but they appreciate having diverse civil society voices at the UN. This is important. Second, increase the size of membership of the NGO committee up from 19. As anyone has seen voting outcomes, the radically different voting outcomes that you will get from a vote on on the same issue that takes place in the NGO committee and then later in ECOSOC can attest to the fact that having a larger membership will produce a much more diverse, a very, very different outcome, and something that has proven to be more positive for NGOs that have been deferred and blocked at the NGO committee. And finally, consider imposing term limits, which is fairly common for UN committees. Now, such a thing will certainly potentially produce a very schizophrenic body, where at times you get a body that is very open to civil society, at other times more hostile, and plenty of times in between where it's somewhere in between. But at least in such an arrangement, you might at times get a body that is very open to civil society organizations. This next category relates to safeguards against the arbitrary delay or denial of consultative status. And as you've heard from our speakers today, this really gets to the heart of the issues with the NGO committee. As anyone who's observed that committee knows, one member state can raise a question during the consideration of an application for consultative status by an NGO, and that's enough to defer that person to the next session. And it can be any question. It can be a question that is relating to information that is very well supplied in the application that was originally submitted. It can be a question that's been answered repeatedly in previous sessions. And it can be many types of questions that are truly arbitrary and really don't go to the issue at hand in terms of whether this is an organization that should receive accreditation. And frankly, there's just no real clear guidelines or rules on the way that the sessions are conducted, which is to say there are no clear ECOSOC guidelines dictating how the NGO committee should consider and assess applicants for consultative status. And there's really no clear working methods within the committee itself. And so you get this scenario where, unfortunately, there aren't the clear guidelines, and then organizations can stay stuck in purgatory for years. My own organization was there itself for 5 years. And so options within this particular category are to consider a change to the resolution and and enact very, very clear guidelines on how to assess applications for consultative status. Something that can be considered is that ECOSOC consider creating a working group of ECOSOC members and members of civil society that come together to draft what these guidelines might look like. Another option is to address the stalemate would be also to put procedures in place within the NGO committee to manage the arbitrary and repetitive questioning. So there's things that we could do in terms of empowering the chair to strike questions that are repetitive or that are arbitrary, require states to explicitly state the grounds or the basis for their question and ensure that it goes to that it is in relation to the matter at hand and the guidelines. And I think one very important thing that has come out of the recent webcasting vote in ECOSOC, which I think we all very much appreciate and believe was very, very critical and important, is that now, previously NGOs had to fly to New York to submit themselves for the Q&A. Now with webcasting, there's the possibility that time can be allotted, as it certainly is now, and NGOs can get on the list to engage in this Q&A over webcast. And this will give the committee the opportunity to have immediate responses to their questions, resolving any concerns they have right then and there, rather than putting them on paper, sending them out to the NGO, and punting it to the very next session. Two more categories, and then we'll move. I'm providing a little bit of pros and cons here and there, but mostly I really want to just keep it short so that we can have some discussion after about the various initiatives and activities that we can take. One thing that can be done now and is being done is to have more engagement from ECOSOC. As it's been said here, what we know is that the mandate for processing and this relationship with NGOs is ECOSOC's mandate. That was the NGO committee was created to help it as a subcommittee with that mandate. And we've seen where ECOSOC has stepped in. We saw where there was the vote on webcasting. Many sessions, ECOSOC members will call resolutions to help bail out organizations that have been deferred for many, many years in the NGO committee. And so there are cases where ECOSOC has been very, very active in terms of trying to help with some of the blockages and the dysfunction inside the NGO committee. But more could be done. Member states informally could agree amongst themselves to call for a certain number of votes on deferred applications every ECOSOC session. And of course, I think something that I would stress, certainly coming from the speakers here, is this needs to be on behalf of organizations located all over the world, not just ones based in the countries which we understand. We understand what it takes to take on this kind of process, but it is important to try to help diverse organizations all over. Another prospect here would be to make it a little bit more official, where ECOSOC has to step in after so many years or such a specified period of time where organizations have been blocked and require a vote. Finally, something that's been debated amongst NGOs and member states alike is the contemplation of simply dissolving the NGO committee entirely and instead creating a new system. This is obviously the most radical. Giving thought to what alternative systems might be feasible and preferable, albeit each carrying their own disadvantages within each. We've debated and we have a few ideas. One is to make it purely administrative. So to task the processing of applications for consultative status with the Secretariat and make it purely an administrative, bureaucratic decision. Where those decisions are made, they go to ECOSOC. If a country wants to take issue with a decision that's made by the Secretariat, they can call for a vote in ECOSOC. Otherwise, it just goes through a bureaucratic system. Second would be to create a hybrid body that would be composed of a mix of member states and representatives from civil society to consider these applications together. And third would be to eliminate the NGO committee and instead create something that would be similar to, which I hope many of you are familiar with, the working groups or the treaty bodies that are composed under the Human Rights Council in Geneva, whereby you have individual experts who operate in the capacity of volunteers that decide on cases within these bodies under the Human Rights Council. You can have individual experts that are drawn from each of the 5 regions that themselves come together in certain sessions, however many sessions per year, and make the decisions on applicants that they then prepare a report that is then sent on to ECOSOC. And similarly, if an ECOSOC member has an issue with recommendations that are made by this expert outside committee, they can raise it at ECOSOC. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that's quite a bit to chew on. And as I said, it really we really tried to look at it from the various perspectives of how do we work within what we have right now? How do we make what we have right now better and improve the functionality of the committee as well as access for organizations to the UN? And then finally, what might be what system might be preferable and feasible? Thank you.
Thanks to you for presenting that raft of possible options. We would be very, very interested in hearing people's views on any of those, and of course any alternatives and additional thoughts you have on how civil society participation could be encouraged and how the NGO committee practice improved. Over to you, please.
My name is Leah. I'm with Save the Children, and I just wanted to address the issue of children's participation at the UN, because even once our organization is in consultative status with ECOSOC, but even once we gain that accreditation, children under 16 still don't have access to the UN, and I think this is very much overlooked. And I know that a lot of the speakers have addressed other underrepresented communities, such as communities from the Global South, but I also think it's really important to bring children's voices into this space. Thank you.
Yes.
My name is Huri Gedelekian. I'm with the International Federation of Business and Professional Women. And I thank you so much for this very well thought out recommendations. And I can think of several of them as being a good lead to take on. Anything different than what it is right now would be helpful. But I just wanted to raise the question of the administrative if we just leave it for Secretariat to do it, I mean, some of the NGOs who are applying or are getting deferred, the complaints I've been hearing is that they're not even aware of when their name comes up or what's going to happen. It's like a lot of these NGOs don't have the finances or the capacity to really follow this clearly. They don't have, they're just grassroots organizations, and to have somebody really keep on top of this is a full-time job. So I just wanted to plant that along with all these other recommendations on whatever it is that we decide, or we always highlight the fact that we got to simplify this. And the other part is that it's not lack of applications. We know there are thousands of NGOs applying and hundreds are getting approval. And there's also the fear of different kinds of NGOs who are not human rights based to have access and really drown out our voices. I mean, we've been experiencing that in many different ways with CSW or any other access. So, yeah, I just wanted to bring those two things up, simplifying it and also just making sure that we always do stay with the human rights approach, no matter who is having access. Thank you.
Thanks to you. Penny.
Thanks, Eleanor, and thank you to the co-sponsors of this event and for all of the speakers for coming and sharing your experiences going through the committee. We share your frustrations. I'm Penny Morton from the Australian Mission here in New York. We are not a member of the NGO committee, but we are a member of ECOSOC, and we have engaged in ECOSOC to review the decisions of the NGO committee on a number of occasions, including in relation to Freedom Now and CPJ, and overturning those decisions. I just want to thank Moran for the points that you've raised. There's a number of really good ideas that we need to discuss, and I can assure you that that member states are discussing these ideas and have been for a while, and we will continue to do so. But there's a lot of new ideas in there. I thank you for your innovation and encourage you to continue to raise these ideas with us, because we are all grappling, obviously, with how we can improve the committee or look at different options to ensure it becomes a gateway and not actually blocking participation. I notice there are a broad range of states in the room, and welcome that engagement. And I think that from our perspective, it really does need to, any progress would need to engage the broad membership. We would want to ensure that it's a process that all members are brought along with in partnership with civil society, and not end up with sort of a confrontational, any of these reforms that we're looking at. We really want to ensure that it's a consensus-based process that has the support of the majority of the membership. I just wanted to note another way of ensuring participation in the UN is to explain how to do it, and Australia has supported the development of an NGO handbook in partnership with the ISHR. And sorry to plug it just now, but we will be launching an update of the NGO handbook in July, on the 10th of July, and I hope that civil society and states can come along to that. And we'll also be producing a new handbook on participation in the third committee, so the Social and Economic Committee, which considers the majority of human rights issues here in the General Assembly. So we can hope you can come to that launch, and we hope that you can also spread the handbook out there to other NGOs that are not yet able to participate in the UN. Thank you.
Yes, Kyla, please.
Thank you, Eleanor. I'm Kyla Brooke from the U.S. mission. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for hosting this side event. I think it's much needed, and we need more of these. I hope this is the first of many. I think this is a conversation that, as Penny said, we've been having for a long time among member states, and how to reform the committee and how to make changes. But we've also had private conversations with civil society, but I think this is the best format to have civil society and member states in the same room. And I really appreciate the comments from all the speakers. I appreciate, Marian, your comments on thoughts on how to make changes. A number of them we've thought of and discounted for many reasons, and others we haven't thought of. And I think it'd be good to discuss, some of the possibilities on this. And as Penny said, it needs to be a consensus as we move forward, and that sometimes is the hardest challenge in this. We also share everyone's frustration as a member who sat on this NGO committee for many years. And the question raised by IDSN, how is it possible that member states stay on for so long? It's because other member states don't put their names forward. And that's something that we have worked very hard on for many years, to get member states to step up and put their names forward on this committee. It's 19 member states. It's divided regionally, so each region has a certain number. And we do need better member states. We need more member states that are going to step up and be a voice for civil society instead of against civil society. As one of the member states, or maybe one of the only ones who questions a number of these questions that go forward to your NGOs, we get pushback, strong pushback from countries in the room who tell us it's not our right to question these questions. But often we question them when we see that they're repetitive, when we see they've already been answered, when we see that the answer is on the website. In order to have other member states' voices in the room with us supporting this, it's going to be very important. Just to address also, if anyone watched the webcast, it was very unfortunate, but we did try to get a member of civil society to speak in the first day following the precedent that was set in 2016. Uruguay requested the floor for the civil society member, and when 3 hours of discussions didn't allow a civil society member to speak for 5 minutes, a vote was called. When that vote failed, the United States called a separate vote, and then, as everyone saw, Russia called a no action motion, so didn't allow it to go forward. But I think it'll be very important that we work together, both member states and civil society, to figure out how to make sure that civil society does have a voice in the civil society or the NGO committee. As I said in the meeting of the NGO committee, it's extremely important that the committee that is tasked with working with NGOs hears from NGOs. And there was a lot of strong pushback, but hopefully if we continue to have these discussions on working methods, that might change in the future. We do need to have the discussion first in the NGO committee itself, but then also it needs to be in a larger body. It needs to be an ECOSOC, and it needs to be with civil society members engaged as well to explain why it's important to hear from their voices. And then lastly, it is nice to see so many member states in the room, but I think as Legal Resource Center, it is a lot of the converted speaking to the converted. So I think this is a very important first step, and that if we continue these type of conversations, perhaps we'll get more and more member states involved, and we can work together to hopefully make much needed change to this committee. Thank you.
I mean, I would just add, of course, that the invitation went out to all member states, and we're very thankful for those in the room, and we look to possibilities for engaging with others in the future. Please.
Hi, Susan O'Malley, International Federation of Business and Professional Women, but also chair of NGO CSW, New York. Now, we had a very, very lively session last Thursday with Jeff Hoffines moderating and Eleanor speaking on the closing space of civil society. So I was just so pleased to hear all of your suggestions, and I wrote them all down about what we could do. All right. Now, where should we start? Certainly in that NGO CSW meets with many, many missions, and we could certainly target a few that we would like to see if they might be willing to join the committee. But how could you expand the number of people on the committee? That seemed to me so interesting, because apparently some of the people on the committee re-up even before their terms are done. According to what Ellen told me last Thursday. So how could we expand the committee? Wouldn't that be what we should do first here? And I also, the thought of the webcasting and what possibilities that opens up to us for immediate discussion and answer to questions. But I'd like your advice on what we could do right now.
Marion, before I come to you on that, let me just take one more question at the back.
Thank you. I'm Naleen Ahmed. I'm the Acting Deputy Chief of the NGO branch. Just wanted to respond to a point that our colleague from the Australian mission had mentioned about training and bridging the gap in the lack of knowledge about the entire process and also how the UN functions and so forth. Just to let you know that within the branch, we have taken many steps to address that. We do have a lack of resources that impede our ability to do more than what we're doing right now. One of the things that we have done is to produce a handbook about how to apply for consultative status, what is ECOSOC and how does that relate to other GA committees and so forth, and within the larger United Nations in the overall context. We have done all of that and translated that within, our limited resources in various languages. We also have regular webinars that we host where we reach out to NGOs through the network of other NGOs that have status and that don't have status everywhere around the world. And globally, we've had a very positive response. But again, it is a question of resources. It is a question of finding the time to do this. As a result of these, we think partly as a result of these measures, we've had an increase in the number of applications that we have been receiving every year. The numbers are going up. The numbers we're looking at next year is going to be a significant increase over what we have had in the past. So there is not it's not an issue of a lack of information, but how to disseminate that, how to actually reach out to the larger community, how to encourage them, and then to train them and build their capacity. these definitely have implications for the resources that the UN actually has at the moment. Thank you.
Maren, there was a question there about where to start first. Do you have thoughts on that?
Sure, and you should, Eleanor, feel free to jump in as well. This is a hard one to answer. I mean, everybody's got different ideas about how feasible it is to change the structure and what should be done. I mean, I think to start, just going back to the various options, to the extent we can work within the current framework, that's ideal, right? I mean, it's better to try to work with what you have than to go with the burn it down and let's rebuild it. Although looking with a view further down the road, that may be where we end up. But for now, in terms of in the short term, what do we do? I think what we should focus on, one, is enhancing the dialogue between civil society and NGO committees. So just trying to increase that to improve that relationship so that maybe some hostility can be reduced. And I think it's secondly what's critical, because the biggest backlog, I mean, going to the question, it has been raised about efficiency. I mean, I think someone mentioned, I mean, just the sheer massive numbers of applications that are now being submitted to the NGO committee. So there are very real questions with respect to efficiency, which again, I think long term will go to how much the current structure with the NGO committee as structured will really be able to process and handle that kind of heft. But putting that aside, I think what's critical is that we deal with the real core of some of the issues here, which are the arbitrary and endless questioning and the backlog of deferred applications. And I think when you look at that, two ways to approach it are, one, more activism from ECOSOC, either officially or unofficially, with friendly nations that are willing to take up these deferred applications in ECOSOC, and two, looking at trying to consider, and I know there are various opinions on this, but putting together more concrete guidelines from ECOSOC that would govern what the guidelines are for the NGO committee to assess accreditation. And then, of course, also working methods. I mean, I think those are the places to start. With respect to the question on how to change the composition of the committee, specifically increasing the number, this is probably better posed to a member state of ECOSOC, but this is something potentially that might be done with a resolution. I suspect it might require an adaptation to the 1996-31 governing resolution. I'm not sure about that.
I think we have time to take a couple more questions, and I want to allow our speakers the opportunity for any last thoughts before we wrap up. Anyone out there with a burning question? Okay, so I'm then going to turn to our speakers here for last thoughts. Robert, can I turn to you first?
Sure. I'm encouraged by this discussion, and grateful for the opportunity to be able to bring some of the issues that we had to this forum. I'd be interested in following up with you on some of the suggestions that you have made for how to make this process more streamlined. I think for us the important takeaway is that we as NGOs are engaged and want to work with the UN system. I believe that we have an important contribution to make, and I think it is incumbent on those member states that agree with us to make sure that those voices are heard in the various forums. It is important. There are very few places where our issues can receive this kind of airing, and so we're committed to continue to work with the committee and with our fellow NGOs. Thank you.
So again, I do think this is a really important initiative. I personally would not focus at this stage on enlarging the committee, but would really appeal that if ECOSOC as a whole could focus on giving guidelines that are very clear and very and really try and enhance or simplify processes, I think that would be extremely useful. I think that the a structure that has already created the handbook it should really look at creating a directory of different civil society organizations with contact information, because I think that civil society organizations themselves ought to think and reflect a little bit more. I think that that would be something quite useful. And I too think that it would be helpful for us to engage amongst ourselves on the back of the imperative of enhancing dialogue between civil society organizations and the UN system as a whole. I think that I wouldn't focus on enhancing that kind of interface between civil society organizations and the committee itself, not because I don't think that that's important, but I think one can then get trapped in the bureaucracy and the frustrations that attach to that, rather than the bigger picture, which is the UN system as a whole.
Thank you, Janet. Camila, let me go over to you for last thoughts.
No, I just want to thank again for the opportunity to join you and say that it was really, really important. It's very relevant to start the dialogue and based on concrete proposals. So I think today we were able to give these first steps and seeing some alternatives, which is constructive. But it's important that this discussion is not only focused in New York. So, and I think this is something that us, like national civil society organizations, should take to our countries and discuss it in our capitals. And especially to build the position of countries that will in the end decide on the future of the NGO community functionality. So it's just want to connect us to bring this discussion to our capital here in Brasilia, and also to encourage other national human rights organizations to do so. Otherwise, if this discussion is only limited to New York, I don't feel like we will be able to gather more and more support needed among states, but also among other civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you very much.
Well, there was a question which I missed, and that was, what did you do during these 9 years? I think somebody from this side asked me that question, and I think I've got a duty to answer that. Of course, in the year 2014, we had the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly, who came out with a report which many of you must be aware of, where the case of IDSN was actually mentioned. We have been lobbying very extensively with a number of countries, including the European Union. In 2015, we had, along with 14 other international organizations, address an open letter to the U.S. Secretary of State on this issue. I can go on. So there were measures that were undertaken by us as well. Two, I think to reiterate the question and for the members of this committee to look at is the fact that gates are closed for some, gates are wide open for many others. And the many others who enter are those who flood the voices of those who speak for human rights in the United Nations bodies. I think that is another phenomenon which was mentioned by our friend there, but I think it needs to be brought into the question. Third is the possibility to consider that where you have repetitive deferrals of certain applications, and they come from a particular country which has a national human rights institution, I don't understand why the National Human Rights Institution is not approached independently to find out what this particular organization is doing in their respective country. And if it is a human rights organization, I'm sure in some way or the other, they would be also making a noise within the geographical focus of their particular country. And that will also test the independence of the National Human Rights Institution in that country. So I think there is some way you have opened doors for NHRIs to come into the General Assembly. I think the NGO committee should at least have an opportunity of considering the possibility of listening to them. And the last is to tell you that this whole webcast business is also seen by many of us who work at the grassroots as a very empowering process. We recently from India had our UPR, the third UPR on the 4th of May. And what was most interesting is that we had 50 live streaming sessions in 50 different cities across the country. And we will vouch to ensure that there will be over 250 when India replies in the Human Rights Council in September to the UPR process. So I think this whole process of opening up is not for a small group of NGOs who sit in their offices to look at the webcast. But how can we bring communities of people who don't follow language, for whom the UN is very, very far away, to be brought into this whole dialogue to see that human rights is a hopeful venture that they can also invest upon and keep away from being drawn into violence that this society is seeing so greatly. Thank you.
I would just say, I mean, thank you for some of the questions and comments about the recommendations. And I would just say to all of you, if you have thoughts about what's been shared in terms of, you know, whether there are certain things that you think are more feasible than others, or if you have some of your own ideas, we'd love to hear from you. So I would encourage everybody to come to us, to Eleanor or to me, and to share this with you, because this will be an ongoing discussion. I mean, we don't want it to be endless. We would like to get started on some initiatives, but it's important to hear from as many people as possible to really put the best approach forward.
Thank you so much to all of you for participating. As so many have said, you know, we hope that this is the start of a conversation, the start of an engagement on this question of strengthening civil society access and participation in the UN. I want to thank very particularly the permanent missions of France, the UK and Uruguay, to the ambassadors Delattre and Rosselli for coming and speaking at the start of the event. Many thanks. And to our NGO co-sponsors, particularly Freedom Now and Jacob Blaustein Institute. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.